Greetings, travelers! I've got something here that's almost as cool as the backside of water, and that is this lovely little spider in a cage. But all jokes aside, this is a prop that I made inspired by a similar prop in the queue line of Disney's Jungle Cruise attraction. And unfortunately, I don't really have a good picture to show of the original prop, but basically it's a spider in a cage like this, and he kind of jumps out at people when they get close to him. I took a few artistic liberties with mine, so he's not an exact replica. And this actually ended up being a very simple and easy prop to make, so I thought I'd share with you guys how I made him. I tried to repurpose as much as I could for this project instead of custom making or cutting any wood, because I wanted to get this project done in a short amount of time. I think it only took me about 3 days to make it. In fact, the only cuts to the wood that I made were the ones for the lid and the one for the spider's mechanism. Now, I won't be going over the electronics aspect of this project too much, because it kind of changes depending on how you want to control it, but I will include some links in the description about solenoids and the related circuitry. Now, you'll see me using a lot of hot glue in this project, because like I said earlier, I wanted to get this done in kind of a short amount of time. And it is high temp hot glue, which does work on wood and metal, but if you're following along at home and you're making this and you want it to be a little bit more structurally sound, I would use something like wood glue instead. So let's get started putting the whole thing together. So here are all the materials that I used. One large wooden box, one slightly smaller wooden box, 18 6-inch wooden dowels. The ones pictured here are actually 12 inches, but I ended up cutting those in half. I also used a couple of scrap pieces of wood. If you don't have random little bits of wood lying around, you can also cut everything out that you will need from one small wooden sheet and one rectangular dowel. I also used some thin metal rods, hardware cloth, and a solenoid to make the spider move. I also used some of this raffia to create the bedding for the spider, and of course, the spider. I'm using a plastic Mexican red knee tarantula from Science Safari, but plastic frogs, rats, and other small creatures would work well too. So the first thing I did was to remove the hinges from the boxes, and you'll want to save the 2 hinges from the large box because we'll be reusing those later. The smaller box had a different kind of hinge that I had to carefully pry off. You can throw those away. Now your boxes can come apart into these different pieces, and here's how those pieces then create the spider cage. The bottom of the large box becomes the base. The lid of the smaller box becomes the lower lip for the cage, and the bottom of the smaller box becomes the top of the cage. The lid of the larger box isn't used, so you can save that for another project. Next, I made the lid on top of the cage. It also occurred to me that if you didn't have the tools to cut out the lid, you could make a false lid by attaching the wooden sheet to the top and screwing on the hinge, but I'm going to make a real working lid. So I cut out a rectangle from the top piece using a combination of a Dremel tool and a jigsaw. And there needs to be a lip for the lid to rest on, so I glued one of those little scrap pieces of wood halfway across the edge on the inside of the box. Then I marked and drilled the pilot holes and screwed on one of the hinges from earlier. But be careful because the ends of the screws stick out, and those are sharp, but you can put a little dollop of hot glue on the end to cover it up. Next, I glued on a scrap piece of wood to act as the handle. And now you've got a working lid! Pretty cool, right? At first I was just going to paint the whole thing, but I had some extra wood stain lying around, and I just love the way the wood stain looks, so I decided to stain it. I stained the lid, the top of the cage, the bottom pieces, the dowels, and this rectangular piece from my scrap wood. This piece will be the sign that goes on the cage. Reattach the lid and glue together the 2 bottom pieces. Position your creature where you want it to go in the box, and mark out where that mechanism is going to go. I'm going to use a solenoid to make my spider move. And then I used a hole saw to cut out the hole for the mechanism. I attached the solenoid under the hole using 2 pieces of wood to hold it, and again, I'm using high temp hot glue, but if you want this to be a more permanent fixture, I would use something else. This is what the spider sits on. It lifts him off of the cage floor a bit, and hinges in the middle using the other one of the hinges that we saved from the larger box. He goes in front of the solenoid and attaches in the back using a paper clip. So now when the solenoid pulls down, the spider will rock back. And you have to be a bit creative about how the spider moves, because the solenoid is very weak. By balancing the spider on the center of the pivot, it makes it easier for the solenoid to move the heavy spider. Test out the movement, make sure everything works. Next, I marked off where each of the wooden dowels would go around the perimeter. and then drilled and added those metal rods. These were a little too short, and I ended up going back and adding longer ones later. I drilled holes into each end of the dowels and slid them onto the rods. The metal rods make for a stronger connection between the dowels and the wooden frame. I also added just a little bit of glue for stability, but I'm not really sure that was needed. Then I took the measurements for the metal caging and used 10 snips to cut out the 4 sections for the 4 sides. And be careful if you work with this stuff, wear thick gloves because this stuff can get pretty sharp. I then painted the mesh with tan acrylic paint. It's really hard to capture the difference on camera, but I found that the plain wire was just too shiny and it was distracting to look through. But by adding the tan paint, it made it look older and dustier, and it made it easier to focus on the spider. I attached it around the inside of the top, and before I put the whole thing together, I went ahead and added the bedding for the spider. It would be wise to glue the bedding down if you plan on moving this prop around a lot, otherwise the bedding can fall out through the holes in the mesh. And I forgot to film the last step, but basically to put the whole thing together, you just take the top half with the mesh and the bottom half with the dowels and just slide the two together. And then you can fit the dowels onto the metal rods on the top. And then for the words on the sign, I just painted those on using black paint. You could probably also do a Sharpie. And then I just glued that to the top corner of the cage. And I know that the original in the Jungle Cruise queue line actually says Uridelma, and mine says Brachypelma. The one in Jungle Cruise is supposed to be like a new kind of spider that they've discovered, and then they've given it the name Uridelma, which of course is not a real spider genus. But my spider is actually a replica of a real spider called the Mexican red-knee tarantula, so I decided to write the genus for the Mexican red-knee tarantula. Last but not least, I got one of these underwater LED discs and then velcroed it to the underside of the lid, and these things are really cool. They're remote control, and they've got like a bunch of different color options. So that's neat. They also usually come in multi-packs, so you can use them for a lot of different projects. So there you have it, a quick fun little project that I think looks super cool. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, consider subscribing. It really helps me out and I really appreciate it. And I better get going. I hear Trader Sam's got a deal going on right now. 2 of his heads for 1 of mine. I can't miss out on that. So I'll see you soon, everybody.